I've always been fascinated by conspiracy theories and stories about Area 51. When I was offered a job doing psychological stress testing at a remote facility, I didn't think twice. The pay was excellent, and the contract promised a short term. But there was a strange clause. No one was allowed to talk about what happened during the tests. I thought this was just standard precautions for military projects until I arrived at the site. It was a white, windowless room, lit by cold, harsh lights. A camera was attached to the upper corner of the wall, always pointed at me. "All you have to do is stay in the room for 48 hours while we monitor your reactions," explained the supervisor, a man in a gray suit and sunglasses. His face betrayed no emotion. "There's nothing to worry about." The first day was uneventful. They gave me water, food, and a small mattress to rest on. I spent the time pacing back and forth, trying to keep myself occupied. The room was silent, except for the faint hum of the lights. But at night, the silence was broken. I was lying on my mattress when I heard a low sound, like a distant whisper. I sat up, trying to identify where it was coming from. The sound was inside the walls. "Can you hear me?" the voice whispered, soft, almost gentle. I stood up quickly, my eyes fixed on the camera. "Is this some kind of hearing test?" I asked, but no one answered. The sound came again, louder this time, as if someone were behind me. "Pay attention," the voice said again, cold and mesmerizing. I looked around, trying to remain calm. The room was empty, just like before, but the feeling of not being alone was suffocating. The buzzing of the lights grew louder, almost like a pressure in my ears. Then the clock stopped. The digital display, which marked the remaining hours of the test, froze at 2:47, and at that moment, the air grew heavier. The camera on the wall slowly turned, pointing directly at me, as if it were observing me more closely. "The test never ends," the voice whispered one last time before disappearing. I knocked on the metal door, demanding an answer. "Is this part of the experiment? Can anyone hear me?" Silence was the only response. That's when I realized that the clock, which had previously stopped, was now running backwards. The clock ticked backwards, each second marked by a dry, metallic sound, echoing in the empty room. The air grew thick, and the feeling of being watched intensified. The buzzing of the lights was louder, almost unbearable, as if pressing on my ears. "The test never ends," the voice repeated, this time closer, almost beside me. "Who's there?" I shouted, turning towards the wall, where the sound seemed to be originating. There was no one, but the shadow of the camera on the wall was different. It seemed larger now, more elongated, as if something were hiding behind it. The clock continued to count backwards, speeding up with each second. I tried to remain calm, but the environment seemed to be changing. The walls were closer, as if the room were slowly contracting. "Is this part of the test?" I asked, staring at the camera. No answer. It was then that the lights flickered. In the split second that the room went dark, I saw a figure in the corner. It was tall, thin, and covered in a kind of fluid shadow. It had no face, just a smooth, dark surface. "It's almost time," the voice said, now deeper and distorted. The lights came back on, and the figure disappeared, but the clock was still counting down, now at an insane speed. The display flashed numbers that made no sense, until suddenly, it stopped again. 0000. The room fell into complete silence. The buzzing of the lights stopped, and the air seemed to turn freezing. The blank display reflected my face, but something was wrong. My reflection blinked. I took a step back, my heart racing, while the reflection remained still, watching me with a smile that shouldn't have been there. The metal door opened with a long creak, revealing a dark, narrow hallway. There was no more buzzing, no more voices, just absolute silence. I picked up my backpack from the corner and took a few steps toward the exit. Looking back one last time, the room was empty, but the camera was still turned toward me, as if it were following me to the door. As I walked down the hallway, A dim light appeared at the end, along with the sound of heavy footsteps. I hurried forward, trying not to look to the sides, but there were shadows moving all along the way, tall, distorted figures that seemed to be following me. Finally, I reached the exit. The supervisor was there, waiting for me. His face remained expressionless, but his eyes were fixed on me in a way that made me feel small. "Congratulations, you passed the test," he said calmly, reaching out to shake my hand. "You can go home now." I didn't say anything. I just walked out, my heart still pounding. Since that day, I've never been the same. At first, it was just a feeling of being watched. Then came the voices, always at night, when everything was quiet. And every time I look at a clock, I see the hands turning backwards, always at 2:47, because the test never ended. I had been working at Area 51 for 3 months when I was given a new assignment, to inspect the underground wing, they said. I thought that was odd, since this area had never been mentioned before. The base had its secrets, but we all knew that certain parts were completely off limits, and the deepest level was one of those places. "This is just a routine check," my supervisor explained. "Don't touch anything, and most importantly, don't enter the room marked Room 7. That should have been enough of a warning to make me suspicious, but my curiosity got the better of me. I followed the narrow hallways, lit by a cold, pale light. The air was thick and carried a metallic smell, mixed with something indefinable but unpleasant. After descending 3 flights of stairs, I found a steel door marked Underground Level 4. It slowly opened, revealing a long, silent hallway. There were several doors lined up, each with numbers painted in red. 1, 2, 3, until finally, at the end of the hallway, I saw the door marked Room 7. My breath caught in my chest. Something about this place felt wrong. The silence wasn't normal. It was the kind of silence that screams, that weighs on you like an invisible presence. I walked past the other doors, trying to ignore my curiosity, but when I reached Room 7, I couldn't move. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a dim light inside. "You shouldn't be here," a voice whispered from inside. My heart raced. I took a step back, trying to stay calm, but something was calling me inside. Against all instinct, I pushed the door open slowly. The room was small and empty, with bare concrete walls. In the center, there was only a metal chair facing the wall. The smell in there was stronger, a mix of rust and something rotten. Before I could react, the door closed by itself with a bang. "Sit down," said the voice again, this time closer, almost next to me. "Sit down." The voice sounded both close and distant at the same time, as if it were inside my head. The air in Room 7 was so thick that breathing seemed impossible. My eyes were fixed on the chair in the center of the room. Something about it felt wrong, but I couldn't look away. "I shouldn't be here," I muttered to myself, trying to calm my pounding heart. I took a step toward the door, but it didn't move. It was as if the entire room was alive, trapping me there. Suddenly, the room began to change. The lights flickered, and for a brief second, I saw something reflected in the concrete walls. My own silhouette, but distorted. It was taller, with arms that were too long, and its head tilted at an impossible angle. When the lights stabilized, the chair was occupied. A figure sat in it. It was shaped like a man, but its skin was gray and shiny, as if it wasn't really flesh. He had no eyes, just black sockets that seemed to suck the light out of the room. His mouth was open in a smile that was too wide. "Sit with me," he said, his voice cold and metallic. My feet felt glued to the floor. I tried to look away, but his eyes, or lack thereof, pulled me like a magnet. He slowly raised a skeletal finger and pointed at me. "You called me. Now I'm here." I didn't do anything," I shouted, my voice shaking. The figure rose from the chair with slow, inhuman movements. His joints creaked, as if his body was not used to moving. He began to approach, and the metallic smell in the air became unbearable. Without thinking, I ran to the door and began pounding on it desperately. "Get me out of here. Please get me out of here." I heard footsteps on the other side. Someone was there. "Open the door," I shouted. But before the door opened, I felt a cold hand touch my shoulder. Everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying in the hallway outside room 7. My head was pounding, and my vision was blurry. The door was closed again, but the feeling of being watched hadn't gone away. The overseer stood there, staring at me with his arms crossed. He didn't look surprised. In fact, his face was calm, almost indifferent. "You came in, didn't you?" he said, his voice steady. I heard something in there," I replied, still trying to catch my breath. "Everyone hears it," he said simply, "but not everyone leaves." Before I could say anything else, he pulled me away from the door. "Forget what you saw. You won't talk about it to anyone. Now go." I left Area 51 that night, but something followed me. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I see a long shadow in the corner of my room, even though there's no one there. Sometimes I feel a cold hand on my shoulder, always at night. And every now and then, I hear that voice again, cold and metallic. "Sit with me, just one more time." Room 7 never let me go completely. I've never been one to believe in conspiracy theories, but that trip to the Nevada desert would change my life forever. I was driving home from a friend in Las Vegas late at night on a deserted road that cut through the area near Area 51. The GPS showed me a shortcut that would save me almost an hour of travel. The road was lonely, with no cell phone signal, but it seemed peaceful. After a few minutes, the car's headlights illuminated a figure in the middle of the road. I stopped abruptly, my heart racing. A man was standing there on the asphalt, looking directly at me. He didn't move or even blink. I thought it might be someone lost, so I rolled down the window and asked, "Are you okay?" No answer. He just stood there, motionless, his eyes fixed on mine. Something was wrong. The man was dressed in regular clothes, but his face looked wrong. The features were slightly distorted, as if someone had tried to copy them, but didn't know exactly what a human face should look like. I decided to keep going, swerving slowly so as not to run him over. As I passed him, the rearview mirror reflected something that made my blood run cold. The man was still standing, but now he was smiling, a wide, unnatural smile. I sped up, trying to get away as quickly as possible. After a few minutes, I looked in the rearview mirror again. The road was empty, or at least I thought it was. It was then that the car radio turned on by itself, emitting a static noise. A low, metallic voice emerged amidst the static, repeating the same phrase over and over. "You can't run away." I looked back at the road, and my heart almost stopped. The man was there, again, standing in the middle of the road. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, other figures slowly emerged from the darkness, all with the same twisted smile, their eyes shining in the headlights. The figures remained still on the road, their eyes fixed on me. Each of them wore the same smile, wide and unnatural, as if their faces were malformed masks. The air inside the car grew heavy, the metallic smell invading my nostrils again. "This isn't happening," I whispered to myself, trying to remain calm. The only thing I could do was accelerate. The car roared as I stepped on the accelerator. The figures fell behind, shrinking into the darkness, but for some reason, their smiles remained visible, even when their bodies were no longer in sight. I drove at full speed, my eyes fixed on the road, not daring to look in the rearview mirror again. Adrenaline coursed through my blood, and for a moment, I thought I was safe. But then, the radio crackled again. The same metallic voice spoke, this time clearer. "You can't escape. They're with you." The car began to lose power. The engine coughed and sputtered, until the vehicle finally died, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. The only light came from the headlights, illuminating a narrow stretch of road ahead. I sat there, trying to start the car again. Nothing. Total silence. Then I heard the footsteps, slow and heavy, coming from outside. I swallowed hard, trying not to panic. I looked to the side and saw a shadow moving around the car, slowly, as if it were surrounding me. "Get out," said the voice, now outside, soft and menacing. I didn't move. My eyes were fixed on the window glass. It was then that, for a brief second, I saw the reflection of a deformed face looking at me through the glass, smiling eerily. The car's lights flickered, and in the brief moment of darkness, they were there again, all around the vehicle, watching in silence. I blinked, and the glass was covered in handprints, as if dozens of people were trying to get in. Without thinking twice, I locked the doors and closed my eyes, waiting for it all to pass. The footsteps continued, the low laughter echoing around me. The smell of rust became unbearable. Suddenly, silence returned. The radio turned off, and the air became light again. I slowly opened my eyes and looked around. The figures had disappeared. I tried to start the car again. The engine roared, as if nothing had happened. I accelerated, leaving that place behind as quickly as possible. But the fear was still there. Since that night, I have never driven down that road again. But something followed me. Sometimes, my car radio turns on by itself, and I hear the same hissing sound as before. And when I am alone at night, I see silhouettes outside the window. They do not move, they just stand there, smiling, always smiling. They never let me go. It all started when I took a temporary job as a radio operator at an airbase near Area 51. The job seemed simple: monitor aircraft communications in flight and record any suspicious activity. Most of the time it was monotonous, just numbers and codes that needed to be filed away. Until that night. The clock read 11:47 p.m. when a strange sound came over the radio. It wasn't a normal transmission. It sounded like static mixed with something else, almost like heavy breathing. "Air traffic control, this is Flight 713, requesting clearance to land." The voice was cold, distant, as if it were coming from far away. I looked at the list of scheduled flights. There was no record of any Flight 713 that night. "Flight 713, this is the control tower. Where are you from?" There was a long pause. The radio crackled again, followed by the same cold tone. "I'm heading home." I felt a chill run down my spine. That simple sentence seemed to be loaded with something dark. I tried to locate the plane on the radar, but there was no signal, just the empty sky over the desert. "Flight 713, confirm your position. We don't have your location on the radar." Another pause, longer this time. Then the voice answered, almost whispering, "Look at the sky." I quickly left the control tower and looked up. A plane was flying in circles, high above the base. Its lights blinked slowly, and for a moment, everything seemed normal. But then, I noticed something terrifying. The plane was flying very low and very slow, almost as if it were floating. "Flight 713, what's your destination?" I asked again, trying to control the tension in my voice. "I never arrive. I just keep flying." That answer froze me. The plane's lights flashed once more, and then, without warning, it disappeared into the dark sky, as if it had never been there. I went back to the tower, my heart pounding, and reviewed the communications logs. There was no record of any transmission from Flight 713. But when I looked at my watch again, it was stuck at 11:47 p.m., the same time the transmission had started. Before I could think of an explanation, the radio crackled again. "I'm coming back," said the same voice, and this time it sounded even closer. "I'm coming back." The voice on the radio sounded so close I could almost feel the coldness of it. I looked up at the sky again, but the plane was gone. The silence of the night was absolute, interrupted only by the low hiss of the radio, like a steady breath. I tried to stay calm, checking the monitors, but something was wrong. The radar flashed, and a red spot appeared on the screen. It moved in circles, exactly where the plane had been before, even though the sky was empty. "Flight 713, identify yourself," I insisted, sweat dripping down my forehead. The answer came almost immediately. I've been here before, and I'll be here again. My heart was pounding. The voice sounded filled with a deep sadness, as if it had been trapped in that moment forever. The radar flashed again, and now the red spot was directly above the tower. Suddenly, the lights went out. The radio still hissed, but this time it was different. There were voices mixed in with the noise, some laughing softly, others whispering words I couldn't understand. The room was dark, and the only light came from the radar screen, which showed the red dots slowly spinning in circles, getting closer and closer. Then I heard footsteps. They were light but steady, echoing through the empty hallway. I grabbed my flashlight and turned slowly, shining it into the entrance. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued, now all around me, as if something invisible was surrounding me. "You've seen me before," the voice whispered behind me. I swung the flashlight quickly, but saw nothing. My heart was about to explode when I realized something terrible. The windows were covered in handprints, as if dozens of people were pressing their faces against the glass, watching me. Without a second thought, I ran to the door and left the tower. The desert air was freezing, and the feeling of being watched had never been so intense. I looked up at the sky again, and there it was, the plane, flying in slow, silent circles, its lights blinking softly. But this time, I could see something different. A shadow stood in the cockpit, motionless, watching me. The radio in my pocket crackled once more. "I'm always here," the voice said. The plane suddenly accelerated, climbing higher and higher until it disappeared into the dark sky. The next morning, I reported everything to my supervisor. He listened silently, his eyes cold and calculating. When I finished, he just smiled and said, "You found Flight 713. "But what is that?" I asked, still shaken. He shook his head, as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "A flight that never reached its destination. It keeps flying, and always comes back. You were lucky to get off." Ever since that day, the radio in my car turns on by itself at 11:47 p.m., always with the same hiss, and sometimes I hear the same voice repeating that phrase, "I'm coming back." And when I look up at the sky, I see flashing lights. They never land. I've always been curious about Area 51, so when some friends invited me to take a road trip to the Nevada desert, I couldn't resist. The idea was to get as close to the fence that delimited the forbidden area as possible. Just for fun, of course. We were on a dirt road, surrounded by nothing but sand and distant mountains. The sky was clear, and the moon lit the way before us. It seemed peaceful, until we realized we were no longer alone. "What's that?" one of my friends asked, pointing to something on the horizon. A figure was standing by the side of the road, thin, tall, and motionless. It didn't look human. Even from a distance, I could see that its skin was a shiny grayish hue, reflecting the moonlight. "Someone must be messing with us," I tried to say, but my voice shook. The driver slowed down as we got closer, but the figure didn't move for a second. It seemed to be watching us, its head tilted slightly to the side. Its arms were too long, almost disproportionate to its body. When we were a few meters away, it took a step forward, revealing a face without defined features, only two large black eyes, without lids, that reflected the light like mirrors. My friend stepped on the accelerator, passing the creature as fast as he could. The car shook, and for a second, I thought we were safe. But when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw something that made me freeze. The creature was running after us, and it was no ordinary run. Its movements were fast, almost impossible, as if it were sliding on the ground. "Accelerate," I shouted, panic taking over me. The speedometer went past 100 kilometers per hour, but the creature did not slow down. It was getting closer and closer, its eyes glowing in the darkness, its face expressionless, but disturbing. Suddenly, it disappeared. The car continued down the road, silence filling the space again. Everyone in the car was gasping for breath, not understanding what had just happened. "Did it go away?" someone asked, still looking out the window. Before I could answer, the car shook violently, as if something had fallen on it. The roof caved in slightly, and the sound of nails scraping against metal echoed above our heads. "It's on the roof," I screamed, panic taking over. The sound of the claws scratching the roof of the car was unbearable, as if it were tearing through the metal. The driver accelerated even more, but the creature was still there, unwavering, each movement shaking the car. The roof gave way a little more, as if something heavy was about to break through. "She's going in," someone in the back seat shouted. Panic spread. My eyes were fixed on the sunken roof, waiting for the moment when the creature would finally break through. The car roared through the desert, dust rising around us, but there was nowhere to go. Then everything went silent. The car stabilized, and the scratching stopped abruptly. We stood in shock for a few seconds, breathing heavily, and fear still pulsing in our chests. "She is gone," the driver whispered, slowing down. I looked out the window, trying to see anything outside. The road was empty, but the air seemed thicker, charged with electricity. Something wasn't right. "Don't stop the car," I said, trying to stay calm. But it was too late. The car began to lose speed, as if the engine was dying on its own. The speedometer dropped to 0, and the car stopped in the middle of nowhere, enveloped by the silence of the desert. "This isn't normal," I whispered, my heart racing. It was then that the radio turned on by itself, emitting a static noise. Among the hissing, a metallic voice appeared, repeating the same phrase several times. "Look behind you." No one moved. The air inside the car became cold, and my mind screamed not to turn. But, as if in an inevitable nightmare, my eyes slowly went to the rearview mirror. It was there. The creature was standing a few meters behind the car, its body partially illuminated by the taillights. Its black eyes shone in the darkness, fixed on mine. It didn't move, but its face was beginning to distort, a wide smile appearing where there had been no mouth. "Go, now," I yelled, tapping the driver on the shoulder. The engine sputtered, but wouldn't start. The radio continued to hiss, and the creature began to walk slowly toward us. Its footsteps made no sound, but each movement seemed closer, as if it were moving in slow motion, until suddenly, it was right next to the window. It tapped gently on the glass with a long, gray finger, its smile growing wider. "Let's go! Let's go!" I yelled. The car finally started, the engine roaring loudly. The driver accelerated, the wheels skidding in the sand as we drove away. The creature stayed behind, its smile still visible in the darkness, until it finally disappeared into the desert. We arrived in town hours later, still in silence, trying to process what had happened. No one wanted to talk about it, but that night, as I was trying to sleep, I felt something wrong. I got up to close my bedroom window, and across the street I saw a silhouette standing still, motionless, watching me. The same silhouette. Her dark eyes shone in the darkness, and the same wide smile slowly spread across her face. She has never left since. Sometimes I hear the radio turn on by itself, with the same voice repeating, "Look behind you." But now, I never look. The house looked perfect. Old brick, tall windows, a spacious yard covered in dry autumn leaves. A dream for any family. But the moment we walked through the door, I knew something was wrong. And that night, we would learn that some pacts are never broken. My name is Daniel Carter, and my wife, Lauren, and I were starting over. We had moved into the house with our 6-year-old daughter, Ivy, wanting a quiet life after a difficult year. The realtor had assured us that no one had lived there in decades. But as we unloaded the boxes, Ivy looked up at the second floor and smiled. "Who's that girl in the window?" Lauren and I exchanged glances. "What girl, honey?" Ivy pointed upstairs. She was there, but now she's gone into hiding. My chest tightened. The upstairs was empty. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could. All the rooms were locked. Not a single living soul was there. or at least not a soul that belonged in this world. That first night, I tried to ignore it. The boxes were piled up in the hallway. Lauren was fast asleep, and then I heard footsteps upstairs, software light, like a child's. I swallowed hard. It must be Ivy, I thought, but when I looked to the side, Ivy was sleeping next to me in bed. The hallway was freezing. My breath formed small clouds of steam as I walked to the stairs. The shades on the windows trembled in the early morning wind. The silence was absolute, until, bam! A door slammed upstairs. My muscles locked. My instincts told me not to go up, but something was pulling me. I pushed the door open slowly. The room was dark, smelling of old wood and dust. The half-open window creaked in the cold wind. In the corner of the room, something made me freeze. Footprints, small, marked in the dust. And then, on the wall, something written in crooked letters. Don't leave the house. The paint was still wet. Or, wasn't it paint? My hands shook. I turned to leave the room, and that's when I saw the reflection in the mirror. A girl, pale skin, dark hair, eyes as deep as holes. She was watching me, and before I could blink, she smiled. The girl smiled in the mirror, but she wasn't in the room. I turned around quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. Nothing, just the suffocating silence of the house. But then, the mirror shook, and I heard it, a whisper coming from the glass. She's coming. My feet moved backwards on their own. The wind from the half-open window made my skin crawl. On the floor, the footprints were still there, clear. And then, a loud knock sounded behind me. Bam! The bedroom door closed by itself. I tried to turn the handle, but it was locked. My chest tightened. I wasn't alone there. The air grew thick. The metallic smell in the room intensified. I looked back at the mirror, and now there was something else there. Behind the girl, a tall figure with gray skin and long fingers held her by the shoulders. Her eyes had no pupils, and when she opened her mouth, there were no teeth, just darkness. My breath failed me. The glass of the mirror shattered by itself. The shards fell to the floor, but none of them reflected my image, only the girl's. She was now inside the room, with her back to me, dark hair disheveled, her white nightgown stained with something dark. She whispered without turning around, "We can't leave." My muscles locked. The door behind me shook as if something wanted to get in. The wood creaked. The girl turned her face slowly, and her eyes were black as emptiness. "You're already part of this." Her voice wasn't that of a child. It was slurred, old, and then the doorknob began to turn. I threw myself against the door. Something on the other side was trying to get in. The knocking grew louder, and then a sharp sound, the sound of nails scratching on wood. "She's here," the girl whispered behind me. I turned my face. She was no longer there, but the shattered mirror now reflected something behind me. The woman, tall, thin, deep, empty eyes. She was standing there, watching me, and before I could react, the door opened. I woke up in the hallway, the cold floor against my face. My breath came in short gasps. The room was intact, the mirror uncracked, the door open. And then I heard Ivy calling from downstairs, "Daddy, who is the girl here?" My blood ran cold. I ran downstairs, and at the end of the hallway, I saw her silhouette, the woman in the mirror, standing next to my daughter, holding her hand, smiling at me. Blackwood Asylum closed over 50 years ago. The government claimed bankruptcy, but the townspeople knew the truth. Patients disappeared. Inhumane treatments were administered in secret, and when the investigations began, the director simply vanished. Since then, no one dared enter the building. But that night, I would break that rule. I am Ryan Carter, an investigative journalist. Stories of abandoned hospitals have always fascinated me, but Blackwood Asylum was different. They said that no one who entered after it closed came away unharmed. Some lost their memories, Others were found wandering the streets, mumbling meaningless numbers. And then there were those who were never found. It was a rumor, and I was there to prove that it was just that, an urban legend. I walked through the rusty iron gates. The moon was covered by clouds, casting long, distorted shadows across the stone path. The huge building loomed before me, its broken windows like empty eyes. The front door was open. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The smell of mold and old medicine filled my lungs. And then the door closed behind me. The main hall still had marks from gurneys dragged across the floor. Yellowed medical papers were scattered across the reception desk. The flashlight illuminated a dirty bulletin board. There were photos of patients, but all of their eyes were crossed out. A chill ran down my spine, but I kept going. The silence was absolute, until a laugh echoed down the hallway, low, faint, but too close. I turned quickly, my heart racing. The flashlight trembled in my hands. The hallway was empty, just old doors, some ajar. And then I saw something move at the end of the hallway, a long, thin shadow crawling across the floor. My blood ran cold. My instincts screamed at me to run, but my ego told me to keep going, and I made the worst mistake of my life. I took a step forward. The hallway seemed to stretch out. The air grew heavy, as if someone was breathing next to me. I reached the door to a room and peered inside. The beam of the flashlight revealed an old gurney, tied with leather straps, and on the wall, someone had scrawled words with fingernails or something worse. "The director sees everything." I felt a chill, but before I could retreat, something pulled me inside. Something pulled me into the room. The door slammed shut behind me with a bang. My lungs seized. The air smelled of mold and dried blood. The flashlight flickered, and then I heard the whispers, low, multiple voices, but all saying the same thing. "He's coming." My eyes swept the dark room. There were broken chains on the walls, deep scratch marks on the floor. In the corner, a patient dressed in stained white scrubs. His skin was pale, his head tilted to the side. His fingers scratched the concrete, forming a strange pattern. When he noticed me, he smiled, but it wasn't a human smile. His teeth were worn down, as if they'd been sawed off. And then, he whispered, "The director wants to meet you." My body froze. The flashlight flashed brighter. The sound of voices grew louder. "He's coming. He's coming. He's coming." The patient tilted his head, as if listening for something, and then he looked behind me. My muscles locked. A chill ran up my spine. I knew what that meant. There was something behind me. I took a deep breath and turned. The door to the room was open, and in the hallway, a tall, skeletal shadow watched me. The director. His old uniform was torn. His face was a blur of twisted flesh, as if no one remembered what he looked like. But his eyes, black, empty. He took a step forward, and the ground shook. The patient began to laugh, fast, maddened. "He'll show you what everyone forgets." The director raised a hand, and then everything went black. I woke up in the operating room. My arms were strapped to a cold iron gurney. The overhead lights flickered, casting distorted shadows across the walls. On the table next to me, rusty instruments still dripped something dark, and in the background, he was there, the director, watching me. "Do you want to know the truth?" His voice was low, slurred, ancient. I tried to scream, but my voice wouldn't come out. He reached out, touching my forehead with long, skeletal fingers. "I'll show you." My mind was invaded. I saw fragmented images, patients trapped in cells, screaming for help, doctors smiling as they tested experimental drugs, and in the center of it all, the director. He was the one in charge. He made them forget, and now he wanted me to forget too. I struggled. The leather of the straps creaked. "I don't belong here." He tilted his head. "Now you do." And then I forgot. I woke up in the hallway of the asylum. The building was silent. The doors were open, But I didn't remember who I was. Only one sentence echoed in my mind. The director sees everything. And then, as I looked at the glass of the broken window, I saw my reflection, my white uniform, my pale skin, and behind me, in the darkness of the hallway, the director smiled. My mother never wanted to tell me who my father was. She said it didn't matter, that some truths were better buried. But when I turned 18, I received a letter with no return address, just 3 words written in dark ink, "Come to Salem." And that night, my life changed forever. I rode the bus for hours, staring at the deserted road and the twisted trees that seemed to watch me. The town of Salem was covered in thick fog. The cobblestone streets creaked beneath my footsteps, and the old houses whispered stories I didn't yet understand. My destination was a large house at the bottom of the hill. When I stopped in front of it, my instincts screamed to turn back, but something inside me kept pulling me forward. The door opened by itself. Inside, an old hall lit by flickering candles. The smell of burning herbs and incense filled the air, and then they appeared. 4 women in black, standing at the top of the stairs. The oldest one stepped forward. Her eyes were as hollow and empty as a starless night sky. "You're finally back." My chest tightened. "I've never been here before." The woman smiled. "You belong here, even if you don't know it." My mouth went dry. Another woman approached, younger, with cat-like eyes and long fingers. "There is power within you, but it is still dormant." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What power?" The old woman replied, "The same that ran in the blood of all the women in your lineage." My heart pounded. "I don't believe in such things." The women looked at each other, amused. Then, the youngest raised her hand. The candles went out at the same time. Silence filled the mansion, and then, a shadow moved in the darkness. I was not alone there. Something was walking around me without touching the ground. The skin on my arm prickled, and then, a cold, hoarse whisper in my ear. "We always knew you would come." The candles relit themselves, and before me, a hooded figure appeared. His eyes were 2 glowing slits, and in his hand was an ancient book covered in strange symbols. "It is time to wake up." The hooded figure handed me the book. The leather cover was ice cold. The symbols etched into the surface pulsed, as if alive. "Read it." My throat went dry. "I can't." The old woman at the top of the stairs tilted her head. "Then why have you come?" The candles flickered. The shadows around us stretched, forming strange shapes. The hooded figure stepped forward. "Your blood has already sworn that oath. Now it's your turn." My hands shook. "What oath?" The cat-eyed woman smiled. "To never deny who you truly are." The book opened on its own. The pages flipped violently, stopping at text written in red ink. I didn't recognize the words, but I understood them. My eyes followed the lines. My mouth murmured the sounds before I even realized it. And then, the wind roared inside the hall. The candles burst into tall flames. The air grew thick, heavy, charged with electricity. And then, I saw it. The shadows weren't shadows. They were eyes, hundreds of them, watching my every move. My skin tingled, and inside my mind, a voice whispered, "Welcome back." I fell to my knees. My head spun. The women around me smiled, pleased. The old woman came closer, touching my forehead with cool fingers. "Now you see, don't you?" My lungs burned. Something inside me opened. The book. It wasn't just a book. It was an invitation, and I had already accepted it. The hooded figure held out his hand. "You are one of us now." I swallowed hard. My heart was pounding, but I knew there was no going back. I belonged here, and deep down, I had always known. The dirt road seemed endless. My car bumped over the potholes as I followed the directions the realtor had sent me. On the horizon, the sun disappeared behind the twisted trees, casting strange shadows along the way. The farmhouse was isolated, perfect for a fresh start, At least, that's what I thought. My name is Nathan Carter. After my divorce, I just wanted a place away from the city where I could breathe again. The farmhouse built in the 19th century was huge, weathered bricks, tall, dark windows, the kind of place that was steeped in history. But as soon as I pulled in, I noticed something strange. The fields around me were dry, as if nothing could grow there. The realtor was waiting for me on the porch. "You got here before sunset," he said, forcing a smile. "Was that a problem?" I joked. He looked away. "Of course not. It's just, some people say the nights here are different." That got stuck in my head, but I ignored it. People always make up stories about old places. The inside of the house was even stranger. The furniture was covered in dust, as if no one had lived there for decades. The floor creaked under my footsteps. The mirrors were covered with sheets. The realtor handed me the keys. "If you need anything, call me." And then he left too quickly, as if he wanted to leave before nightfall. The first night was strange. The silence of the farm was absolute. No wind, no crickets, just the house breathing on its own. Then I heard footsteps. Outside, someone was walking across the field. I grabbed my flashlight and went to the porch. Darkness swallowed everything. But then I saw it. Fresh footprints in the dry earth. They led to the field and stopped in the middle of nowhere, as if someone had simply disappeared. That's when I heard it. A voice whispering behind me. Low, creeping, ancient. "You shouldn't be here." My lungs seized up. I turned slowly, expecting to see something. But the porch was empty. The door to the house closed by itself. My heart was pounding. I gripped the flashlight tightly and went back inside. But as soon as I closed the door, someone laughed. Low, feminine, and it was coming from upstairs. My body froze. The second floor was still empty. The boxes were still closed, the furniture covered. But then, the creak of wood, footsteps. Someone stepped down a step, then another. Then it stopped. The air around me grew heavy. I felt something, someone, watching me. And then, in the covered mirror beside the stairs, I saw a reflection. A woman, in a white dress, long hair, her face blurred, as if it were wrong. I turned around suddenly. Nothing. The stairs were empty. But when I looked back into the mirror, she was closer. And now, she was smiling. The mirror shook. The woman was smiling, but her reflection looked wrong, distorted. I turned around as quickly as I could. The hallway was empty, but when I looked back at the mirror, she was even closer. My lungs seized up. The flashlight flickered. A strong smell of damp earth invaded my nostrils. And then, I heard the first whisper, low, dragged. "She's still here." The sound didn't come from behind, or from the mirror. It came from inside the house. I walked up the stairs slowly. With each step I took, the silence grew thicker. The house wasn't just old. It felt alive. The air grew heavy, and a chilly wind rushed past me. Then, I heard laughter. Faint, feminine. But now, it was coming from inside my room. The doorknob was cold. My chest was rising and falling fast. I turned slowly. The door creaked, and then, the room was empty. But there was something new there. In the center of the wooden floor, footprints, small, wet, leading to my bed, and on the pillow, a headprint, as if someone had just lain down there. My heart was pounding. I approached slowly. The smell of earth was stronger there. I lifted the pillow, and beneath it, an old photo. A woman, white dress, long hair, sunken eyes, and behind her, a charred barn. I turned the photo over. There was writing, a name, Eleanor, and 3 scrawled words. She never left. I felt a shiver run down my spine. But then, I heard a sound in the hallway, a slow shuffling of feet, as if someone was waiting for me to open the door. I gripped the flashlight tightly and turned the knob. Nothing. The hallway was dark and empty, but the smell of earth was now coming from downstairs. I walked downstairs. the flashlight shaking in my hand. The wind blew softly through the closed windows, and then I saw footprints in wet dirt leading to the back door. The knob turned on its own. The door slowly opened. The yard was plunged into darkness, and there, in the middle of the dry field, the silhouette of a woman watched me, motionless, pale skin, white dress, Eleanor. My feet were rooted to the ground. She wasn't moving, but I could feel it. She wanted me to come to her. The wind grew stronger. The earth seemed to shift beneath my feet. And then she took a step forward, and I heard it, low, cold, inside my head. It's time to know the truth. The world didn't end with a bang. It ended slowly. First, the radio signals disappeared. Then the skies turned red. And when the moon rose, bleeding into the night, humanity was forgotten. What came next? No one can explain. But we all felt it. It was as if something had awakened, and it was hungry. My name is Ethan Carter, and I should be dead. The bombs fell 3 months ago. Some say it was war. Others say it was something much worse. But it doesn't matter anymore. The world we knew is over. Cities burned. The sky was never blue again. And those who survived changed. I walked alone down destroyed roads. I passed empty houses, looted supermarkets. I heard whispers coming from dark alleys, but I never found anyone until I got to Vault 17, a bunker underground, dim lights, cracked concrete walls, 50 survivors, the last remnants of humanity, or so we thought. The vault was quiet. People didn't talk. They didn't ask names. They didn't smile. They just stared at the ground, as if they already knew it wouldn't last. And then I saw him, the man in the dark suit, tall, pale, with sunken eyes. He never ate. He never slept. He just stood in the shadows of the hallway, watching me. On the second night, something changed. The generator started to fail. The lights flickered. The air grew thick. And then, we heard the first scream. It was coming from the dormitories. We ran there, but it was too late. The body was wrong. The bones were crooked. The eyes were empty. And on the wall, written in blood, "He is here." Panic took over. Someone shouted that we should leave, but there was nothing outside, so we stayed. We tried to ignore the noises in the hallways, the shadows that moved on their own, the smell of sulfur that permeated the air. And then, on the third night, the blood moon shone again, and one by one, we began to disappear. I woke up suddenly, my mouth dry, my breath labored. The refuge was completely silent. I could hear only the sound of my own heart beating. The bed next to mine was empty. The mattress was still warm, as if someone had just left it. But no one left. No one ever left. And then I saw it. At the door to the dormitory, the man in the dark suit was watching me, and he smiled. The man in the dark suit smiled. It was a wrong smile, without emotion, without humanity. His sunken eyes were empty, as if they absorbed all the light around them. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. That's when I realized I couldn't breathe. My mouth opened in a silent scream. My lungs felt empty, as if the air had been forcibly knocked out of them. The man didn't move. He just stared. And then he spoke. His voice was low, cold, like the sound of something crawling in the darkness. "Wake up." My eyes widened, and then I was plunged into darkness. I woke up in the hallway of Vault 17, the cold concrete floor against my face. My head throbbed. All around me, lights flickered dimly. The smell of sulfur hung in the air, but something was different. The shelter was empty. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest. The dorm doors were open. The bunk beds were skewed, the mattresses torn, as if something had been there. And then I heard it, a distant sound, low, like a whisper coming from the end of the hallway. I didn't want to follow it, but my feet moved on their own. The walls of the hallway seemed to close in around me. The air grew heavier, suffocating. Each step echoed on the cold concrete. And then I reached the door to the cafeteria. It was ajar, and behind it, the sound continued, a low, incomprehensible murmur, like several voices talking at once. I pushed the door open slowly. The flashlight trembled in my hand. The room was dark, lit only by the faint light of the blood moon shining through a vent. And then I saw it. The people from the refuge were there, but they weren't normal. Their bodies were twisted, their skin too pale, almost gray. Their eyes were sunken and empty. They were all sitting around a long table. At the head of it was the man in the dark suit. He looked at me and smiled again. "He's finally awake." His voice echoed in my mind. The other survivors turned their heads at the same time. Their necks cracked like rotten wood. Their eyes didn't blink. They weren't breathing. And then they spoke together, voices overlapping. "Come sit with us." My vision went black for a second. My body wouldn't obey me anymore. I didn't want to go, but my feet moved on their own, each step heavier than the last. The blood moon shone outside. I knew there was no escape. I sat down at the table. The voices whispered inside my mind. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But when I looked at the glass of the vent, I saw my reflection. My eyes. Now they were black like theirs. And then I understood. The blood moon didn't bring the end of the world. It just showed us the truth. I don't know if what I heard on that station was human. Maybe it was just an old echo, pulsing through the ice and the silence. Or maybe it was something that should never have been tuned in. My name is Rick Thorne, and I was a radio technician hired by a mining company to oversee emergency broadcasts and maintain communications between camps scattered along the west coast of Alaska. In mid-November, I was transferred to Nome, a remote town nearly buried in snow and surrounded by absolute silence. The job was simple: make sure the radios kept working between the mining sites in the area, especially since winter had swallowed up the roads. But there was one station in particular, marked N104, that was listed in the logs. But no one seemed to know exactly where it was. I was greeted by Dale, the local supervisor, a quiet man, always looking over his shoulder. "Don't worry about N104, he said, handing me the network map. "That station was shut down in the 1980s, but it still transmits," I replied. I picked up a signal when I passed by the coast. Background noise, static, and a voice. Dale stared at me for several long seconds, then muttered, "Then you should never go there." I ignored the warning, of course. I'm curious by nature, or maybe I'm stubborn. The fact is, that very night I set up my equipment and spent hours trying to triangulate the location of the signal. And the more I adjusted the frequency, the clearer the transmission became. And that's when I heard it for the first time. "Base N104, anyone there?" The voice was faint, as if it had been recorded on an old tape. It repeated in cycles, every 2 minutes. Then came a second snippet, a whisper, barely audible. "Don't turn off the light." The next morning, I got on a snowmobile and headed toward the source of the signal. It took me 3 hours to cross ice, frozen forest, and complete solitude. The sky was white, and the wind seemed to carry voices that were lost in the thin air. Finally, I found the station. Small, gray, with peeling paint. It looked abandoned for decades. The antenna stood upright, slowly turning in the wind. No generators were working, no footprints other than my own. And yet, the tower light was on. I walked in slowly. The door creaked, and a musty, frozen smell invaded my nostrils. The interior was cramped, with old panels, analog dials, reels of magnetic tape, and a central radio with the screen still on. The whole place looked like a museum, but someone kept it, or something. On the table, a diary. The cover was torn, and the pages stuck together. I read what I could. Automatic transmission maintained, but the source of the voice, no one knows where it's coming from. Sometimes it answers questions. Sometimes it repeats things that haven't been said yet. I started recording. I tuned the channel again and listened. Base N104. Anyone there? This time I answered. This is Rick Thorne, radio technician. I'm at the station. Silence, then a loud noise, a hiss, like a scream distorted by time, and then, "Rick, you're late." I jumped up. I looked around. Who's there? Nothing, until the radio hissed again and whispered, "You shouldn't be here." The temperature inside the station began to drop. The door, which I had left ajar, slammed shut on its own with a loud bang. The radio went out. The lights flickered. And then, a metallic clang from the basement. Yes, there was a hatch in the corner of the floor. I hadn't seen it before. I approached cautiously, turned on my flashlight, and opened it. Narrow steps led down to a subterranean room. I went down. The air was heavy, the silence almost painful. Below, a wall covered with recordings, audio tapes labeled with dates that went up to 2024, but the current year was 2023. I picked up a tape with next week's date. I put it in the recorder. My own voice said, "I can't get out. The station won't let me." I went back upstairs in a panic. I tried the door, locked. I tried the radio, dead. I screamed, nothing. And then, all the lights in the station went out. Only the tape recorder played now, repeating my own voice. "Don't turn off the light. Don't turn off the light." I've been trapped here for hours, or days maybe. Outside, the snow covers everything. Inside, the static never stops. And now, the radio whispers again. N104 base. Rick, are you ready for second warning? Time didn't pass inside the station. Or maybe it passed too quickly. Everything there seemed suspended, as if the clock had stopped along with the world outside. I tried to keep my sanity, telling myself that there was a logical explanation, that the voice was some ancient interference, that the diary was fiction, that the tape with my voice was an absurd coincidence. But the station kept whispering, and I kept hearing myself before I spoke. On the third day, or third night, I can't remember anymore. I tried to break down the door with the iron ladder from the basement, without success. The metal seemed welded together from the inside, as if it had been melted by extreme heat. I gave up and went back to the tape recorder. There were more tapes. Some were marked with words instead of dates. Answers, cycle, last day. I chose the one with cycle. I put it in the tape player and pressed play. The recording started with static. Then my voice came on, exhausted, hoarser, more broken. "You'll try to escape tomorrow. It's no use. The station won't let you. You'll think you've been walking for hours, but you'll always end up back here, because here isn't the same place you came from." I threw the tape away. I went down to the basement, my flashlight nearly dead, trying to find some hidden exit. But at the back of the equipment room, I saw something new. A steel door with a small hatch. I hadn't seen that before. When I looked through the viewfinder, I saw nothing, just darkness and snow. But I heard footsteps in the snow, and then a knock, 3 times. Someone or something outside. I opened the hatch and called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Silence, until I heard my own voice. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I closed the hatch immediately. I climbed up, knocking my knees on the ladder, trying not to panic. When I reached the main room, all the radios were on, but they weren't transmitting static. They were transmitting laughter. Laughter that came in different tones, speeds, depths. Some sounded like children, others like old people, and in the middle of it, mine. I turned off all the radios, one by one, but as soon as the last one was turned off, the station's generator exploded. A flash of light illuminated the room, and all the lights went out. I stood there, in complete darkness, listening to the rapid breathing that I thought was my own, until I realized it was coming from the other room. Someone was imitating me. I grabbed the dim flashlight and went to the entrance. The door was now ajar, although it had been locked minutes before. Outside, the world looked different. The sky was darker than it should have been. The snow fell soundlessly, and the footprints led away, the same footprints as my boots. I followed it for a few yards. into the pine forest. That's when I saw it. Another station, exactly like N104. Same antenna, same broken window, same rusted sign. I ran inside and found myself sitting, huddled, shivering. "I told you so," he said. "Or I did. It's a cycle, and you just started it all over again." "Who are you?" "Someone who thought they could fix a radio." And then he was gone, like dust. I ran back to the original station, but it was gone. In its place was just turned snow, old bulldozer tracks, and a fallen, half-buried sign. Facility N104, permanently closed, 1987. Today, I'm somewhere else. A hospital, they say, but the radios here still transmit, even when they're turned off, and the voice I hear on them is still mine, but saying things I haven't experienced yet, and I'll never know if it's me remembering or being remembered. When I first heard about it, I thought it was just another barroom story told by drunk fishermen trying to scare away strangers. When the fog rolls in heavy in Juneau, stay home. If you see someone standing in the street, don't stare too long. The man who said it was named Glenn, his face weathered by the cold and years at sea. I laughed, ordered another beer, and put the warning in the back of my mind. But that week, the fog came in really thick, and I saw it with my own eyes. My name is Eric Rains. I'm a documentary photographer. I came to Alaska to capture the wildlife, the urban isolation, and the long darkness of winter nights. I arrived in Juneau in late October, just as the city was preparing to hide under the clouds. I had planned to stay for 2 weeks, maybe 3, but when the fog started to fall, I felt paralyzed. I stayed in a small rented apartment near the port. It had everything I needed: silence, internet, and large windows overlooking the empty streets. In the first few days, I photographed frozen forests, wet streets, the thick sea of clouds. But at night, something seemed strange. The silence became too oppressive, and the city seemed smaller. On the night of the 28th, the fog descended like never before, thick, milky, swallowing the city lights. I was in the living room editing photos when I noticed a figure standing on the other side of the street, motionless, in a dark suit, without an umbrella, in the middle of the fog. I instinctively took a picture with the long lens. The stranger didn't move, didn't turn around, didn't go into any house. He stayed there for almost an hour, and then he disappeared. The next morning, I went to show the picture to the owner of an antique shop where I had bought an old map of the city, an old man named Oscar with sunken eyes and shaking hands. When he saw the picture, his face lost all color. "You saw him." "Who?" "The man in the fog." According to Oscar, reports of that same figure have been appearing in old city archives since the 1920s, always on the same kind of night, always on the same kind of street. Nobody knows where he comes from. He never talks, he never moves. But when you look at him too long, what? Oscar just pointed to a painting on the wall. A smiling woman, her hair tied back, wearing a World War II nurse's uniform. That was my sister. She saw it. I swallowed hard. What happened to her? She disappeared. That should have been enough to make me walk away, but I did the opposite. I installed automatic cameras on the street. I programmed motion sensors. I spent the nights watching. In the early hours of the 31st, while the city slept under the fog, he came back. Same spot, same pose. But this time, he turned his head. My breath caught. The camera lens shook. His face was partially visible, and it was featureless, smooth, pale, as if it had been erased. And yet, he saw me. I felt it, even from the window, even hidden. I felt as if the eyes he didn't have were glued to me. I ran to the bathroom. I locked myself in. The silence was total. After a while, I heard footsteps, slowly moving away, and then knocking on the door, but not from the bathroom, from the apartment door. I waited until dawn. When I finally gathered the courage to go out, he was no longer there, but something was there. a mark on the camera lens, like a palmed hand made of mist. On the screen, the last photo taken was distorted, as if the file had been corrupted at the exact moment he saw me. I went back to Oscar that same day. "Did you take a picture of him?" he asked, desperate. "Yes." "Delete it. Burn it. Throw it in the sea." "Why?" "Because he doesn't like to be remembered." That night, the mist entered the house, not through the door, through the walls, through the ceiling, as if it were breathing with me. I lay on the couch, cell phone in hand, trying to keep my sanity, and then he appeared again, inside my reflection, in the living room mirror, standing behind me, faceless, nameless, but now, inside my house. That night, I slept with all the lights on, the mirror in the living room covered with a sheet, the radio turned on static, the cell phone in airplane mode, but none of that helped, because when I closed my eyes, he was already there, not in my dreams, in reality. I woke up to the sound of dripping, but there was no water. The ceiling was dry, so was the floor. The sound came from the bedroom. I walked slowly, feeling the air get denser. The sheet over the mirror trembled, even with the windows closed, and when I lifted the corner to look, I saw my reflection smiling. But I wasn't smiling. My face was still, and the reflection had eyes. I ran outside, tripping over the camera cables. I went to the street, hoping to find movement, people, anything that would get me out of it, but the entire city disappeared into the mist. Literally, the buildings were gone, the lights were swallowed, the ground looked like it was made of damp cotton, and in the center of it all, standing still, as always, him, the man in the mist, black suit, faceless, motionless, staring at me, or at least feeling that I was staring at him. And the more I stared at him, the more I felt my memories fading. I ran to Oscar's house. I knocked. I screamed. He opened it, eyes wide, as if he already knew. "Did you see him again?" he asked, breathless. He came in. He came into my house. Oscar pulled me inside, closed all the curtains, turned off the lights. He comes in when you try to understand him, when you try to record, capture, remember. But what is he? Oscar hesitated. Something old, a mistake, a rift between worlds. It has no name because the name has been forgotten, and it feeds on that. Feeds on what? What you are. On the wall of Oscar's basement, there were old newspaper clippings, disappearances, all on foggy nights, all in the same area, some names crossed out, others without faces. "What do you keep these for?" I asked. "To remember who I was." "What do you mean?" Oscar showed me an old photo, 2 boys. One of them was him, the other, his face was blurred out. He was my brother. He disappeared in 1949, and after a while, no one remembered him anymore. Not my parents, not the school, only me. "Did you try to look for him?" "I tried, but the more I tried, the more I forgot." "What now?" Oscar took a deep breath. "Now it's your turn." I went back to the apartment before nightfall. When I opened the door, the mirror in the living room was clean, no sheets, and in the reflection, he was sitting on my couch, as if he was waiting for me. I looked back, nothing, but in the mirror, he turned his head and murmured, "You already know how it ends." The pictures on the camera were gone. The hard drive was empty. The name Eric Rains had disappeared from the hotel records. My emails had been returned. My bank account was empty. It was as if I was being erased. On my last attempt, I grabbed my camera and went to the port. The fog was already taking over everything. I stood there, waiting, and when he appeared, I raised the camera, but this time, not to take a picture. I pointed the lens at myself, and I said out loud, "My name is Eric Rains. I was born in Seattle. I'm a photographer, and I remember." The fog trembled. The sound stopped. He finally approached, unhurriedly, and when he was just a few steps away, I saw my own face under the fog, but without eyes, without a mouth, without memory. The camera fell. The image froze. Today, I write this the only way I can, in a notebook, left on Oscar's doorstep, because I know he still remembers, and someone needs to remember me, before the man in the fog takes me away for good, or worse, before I become him. When you live long enough in Alaska, you begin to understand that silence has layers. There's the silence of the snow covering everything, muffling sounds like a cold blanket. Then there's the silence of the forests, deep, ancient, as if something were hiding among the tree trunks. But worst of all is the silence that comes from the sky. It's a kind of emptiness that seems to watch you. It was in that silence that I found the briefcase, and since then, nothing has been the same. My name is Jake Thorne. I fly small transport planes in northern Alaska. I work with cargo, mail, medical supplies, basically anything that can be transported by air between the small towns forgotten by time. Last March, I was flying over the Kobuk region when I spotted something strange on the ice below. It wasn't a runway or a cabin. It was a glint, a metallic glint, half buried in the snow, in the middle of nowhere. I sped up and made an impromptu landing in a clearing. I left the engine running and walked over with the radio strapped to my shoulder and my hand on the flashlight. What I found was a black suitcase, partially covered in ice. It was hard, heavy, with chrome latches and a corroded metal label. Flight 162, federal property. I took the suitcase with me. I couldn't open it until I got home to Fairbanks. It didn't have a traditional lock, but rather an old-fashioned magnetic system. With some effort, I managed to unlock it. Inside were a reel-to-reel tape recorder with the tape still intact, a name tag reading M. Doyle, Special Operations, a yellowed photograph of a military plane in the snow, a small notebook with handwritten notes. The tape was labeled with the date, November 2nd, 1971, final. I don't know why, but I didn't take the suitcase to the police. Something about that discovery made me feel like she didn't want anyone else to find her. That night, I listened to the recording. The audio was crackling, but slowly, a voice emerged. But the weirdest thing was that it was my voice. Flight 162, this is Thorne. We're seeing something. It wasn't part of the mission. It's like an aurora, but it's moving. It's looking. Crawl. Then screams, metal twisted, and then whispers, words in a language I didn't know, but understood perfectly. We never crashed, we're just out of time. I threw the recorder on the floor. I went to the sink and splashed water on my face, but when I came back, the case was closed again, and the tape was gone. In the days that followed, I began to have strange dreams. I was flying over unknown regions. The stars in the sky changed places. There was no sound, no wind, just a voice in the background, repeating numbers in sequence, 162, 162, 162. And then the plane crashed, always. But I never died. I just woke up with blood coming out of my nose. I researched Flight 162. No information, no recorded crash. No pilot named Doyle, but a friend at air traffic control, after much insistence, confessed, "Man, that number shouldn't exist. It shows up as redacted." "What do you mean?" "It's as if it had flown, but never landed." I went back to the place where I found the suitcase. I took a drone with an infrared camera. I flew over the area, and something appeared. A plane, half buried, invisible to the naked eye. Only with infrared could you see its shape. I landed the drone and went on foot. I walked for hours. The compass kept spinning. When I found the wreckage, I understood everything, because the plane was the same one in the photo inside the suitcase. And what was inside it? It was my body, frozen, sitting in the cockpit, with my jacket, my badge, and my hand holding the same suitcase. I ran back, but I couldn't find my way back to the plane or to my own plane. I was stuck there for 2 nights, but no one believes me. Today, the suitcase disappeared from my locker, but the recording came back to my phone, even though I never scanned it. And when I hit play, the voice speaking now is no longer mine. It's that of a man who says, Flight 162, still en route. Estimated arrival, never. Ever since the day I found my own body inside that plane, my life has been a series of emptinesses. I can no longer trust mirrors, reflections, voices, or memory. Everything seems unstable. I returned to Fairbanks covered in ice and mud, walking until I found a road. I was taken to the hospital and diagnosed with hypothermia and mental confusion. But I knew that I was not the same man who had entered those woods. And the missing suitcase, it came back on the third day of hospitalization, at the foot of my bed, without anyone seeing who put it there. This time I didn't have to force the locks. It opened by itself, and inside there was no more recorder, just a note, handwritten. You flew, Jake. Now you need to land. Folded next to the paper was an old boarding pass, stamped with Flight 162 check-in reactivated. That night, I had the worst dream. I was in a cockpit. Beside me, my older body, lifeless, frozen, stared at me with open eyes and a sewn-up mouth. The radio crackled. A control tower called to me. Flight 162, position. I don't know where I am. Then stay on course. Course to where? To yourself. I woke up screaming. The nurses said I'd been having seizures, but I knew what it was. It was the plane trying to pull me back. A few days later, I went to the same air traffic controller who told me about the redacted flight. Jake, you've got to stop this. That flight existed. I saw it. I saw my body. He hesitated. Look, I found a radar recording. It's from 1971. No one should have that. But I did. He showed me an old spectrogram. Amid the static, a route appeared. A dot blinked red. That was 162, he said. But the weird thing is, it never left the screen. It just sat there, still, for hours, days. And then what? We turned off the radar, but when we turned it back on, it was still there. I went back to where I'd found the briefcase. This time I brought a portable radio, and at 2:43 a.m., a frequency opened by itself. Jake Thorne, cleared for landing. Negative, I'm not in the air, I'm on the ground. You never landed, Jake. What's this place? Come in, for the last time. The wind blew hard, pushing the snow in a specific direction. I followed it, more out of instinct than reason. And there it was. The plane, still, frozen, just like before, but now, with the lights on, and the door open. I climbed the steps, guided by something that wasn't courage. It was as if my feet knew the way. Inside the cabin, everything was clean, working. Lights, dials, controls. In the pilot's chair, my reflection. Literally, I could see myself. But I was older, tired eyes, unshaven. He stared at me. Ready to land? He asked. What's this? That's you, Jake. After the landing that never happened. I don't understand. You fell, but not in the way you think. You fell out of time, and now, someone has to keep the cycle going. What if I don't want to? He smiled. Then you'll never get out of here again. I ran out of the cabin. I jumped down the stairs. The plane disappeared behind me, as if it had never been there. Today, I live in a strange state. I no longer sleep. I do not dream, but I listen to the radio, always. And every night, at 2:43 a.m., the same message appears on frequency 162.0. Jake Thorne, cleared for landing. And every time, my answer is the same. Refused. But I know that one day, the voice on the radio will change, and it will no longer be me who answers. It will be Jake who has already landed, and when that happens, Flight 162 will be complete. Alaska is unforgiving to those who like to wander alone. I learned that too late. My name is Alan Mercer. I'm a cartographer and geologist working for a company that maps changes in permafrost around the Arctic Circle. 3 months ago, I was sent to Utqiagvik, formerly Barrow, the northernmost point in the United States, where the sun doesn't rise for months during the winter, and the ice seems to swallow time. It was supposed to be a routine mission: spend 2 weeks at an outpost, collect soil samples, record coordinates with drones and satellites, and return before the cold reached the point of uninhabitability. But on the 8th day, I saw the footprints, and everything changed. It was a dark January morning, minus 35 degrees Celsius, and the wind cutting like a knife. I had set out on my snowmobile toward a fresh patch of exposed ground, a thermal anomaly that had shown up on the radar. After a few hours in the field, something caught my eye on the thermal imager: a heat trail, footprints, recent, human, and the strangest thing, they weren't coming from anywhere. They started in the middle of the ice in a straight line and headed south. I followed the tracks for almost a kilometer. No branches, no sign of equipment, camp, or vehicle. Barefoot footprints in the middle of the Arctic, and then they disappeared, out of nowhere, in the middle of a flat field of ice. I went back to the base station trying to explain it to myself. I thawed my fingers as I reviewed the thermal images, looking for some flaw, some technical explanation. But they were there, clear, deep, a precise march, footprints of someone who shouldn't exist. That night, I stayed awake. The station's generator hummed weakly. The light flickered at times, as if the cold was overcoming the structure. At 3:12 a.m., the external motion detector beeped. I walked over to the monitor screen and saw it, footprints appearing, alone, no body, no shadow, just footprints appearing, one after another, leading from the frozen forest to the side of the station. I ran to the door. I opened it with the flashlight in my hand. Nothing, but the prints were there, in the ice, fresh, perfect, from someone or something. I radioed a colleague the next day. Jared, the technician at the base in Prudhoe Bay, thought I was delirious from the isolation. "Alan, that's just ice, refraction, blowing snow. You're seeing what you want to see." "I have pictures, Jared." "So what are you going to do? Follow them to the sea?" He laughed. I hung up, but by then, my mind was made up. The next night, the footprints came back, at exactly 3:12 a.m., and this time, they circled the station, and they left a mark on the door, a handprint, no fingers, just the shape of something trying to imitate a hand. On the third night, I went out, with a flashlight, GPS, and emergency rifle. I waited for the footprints to appear and followed them. With each step, the sensation grew worse. It was like walking in a field where time did not exist. The footprints descended through a valley of packed snow, circled an ancient stone, and then disappeared again. But there, in the middle of nowhere, there was something. A cabin, blackened wood, covered in snow, barely visible in the darkness, and the door, ajar. I went in. The beam of the flashlight revealed walls covered in markings, carved symbols, spirals, names repeated over and over. In the center, a rocking chair, and in it, a figure covered in a blanket. I thought it was a mannequin, but as I approached, the thing was breathing, slowly and deeply. "Who are you?" I asked, not expecting an answer. The thing didn't move, but then behind me, the door closed by itself, and the voice came, not from the chair, but from the wall. "You followed them. Now they're following you." I ran. I ran back to the station, desperate. But when I looked at the floor, footprints were following me, and now they weren't just outside. They were inside, to the bathroom, to the kitchen, to my bedroom, and they stopped right behind my bed. On the last night, before the rescue helicopter arrived, I left a camera on the tripod. When I developed the images, I saw them. During the early morning, footprints appeared. The door opened, and a white silhouette crossed the room, with no eyes, no mouth, but walking like a person. At the end of the video, the thing stopped in front of the camera and stayed there, staring, for 3 hours and 12 minutes, until daybreak. The footage from the night before stuck in my head like a virus. For days, even after I left Barrow and returned to Anchorage, I saw that white figure every time I closed my eyes. The shape of it, the way it stood still, the amount of time it spent watching the camera, as if it knew it was being filmed, or worse, as if it was waiting for me. I tried to move on with my life. I turned in the reports, deleted the copies of the footage from my laptop, discarded the mission materials. But the next night, I received an email. No sender, no title, just a video file, the same one from the cabin, but with 2 more minutes at the end. I opened it. The figure, after standing still for hours, was moving closer to the lens. The image was shaking. Static filled the screen. And then, it was whispering, in a low, freezing voice that seemed to speak inside my chest. "There's still snow under your feet, Alan. You never left there." I dropped the notebook on the floor. The clock read 3:12 a.m., the same time the footprints appeared, the same time the world seemed to turn upside down. The next morning, I went to the company lab to get the drone data used in the mission. The analysis technician took me aside. "Are you sure you were alone, Alan?" "Yes. Why?" She showed me a thermal sequence. One of the images showed 2 heat sources moving side by side on the ice field. "That was on the 11th, she said. "One of the signals is yours, but the other has no record of departure. It starts from nowhere." "And where does it go?" "It still goes, even today, even with no one there." I caught the first flight back to Barrow. I didn't tell anyone. I just took a recorder, a thermal camera, and a question. What had followed me that night? Was it still there? In the abandoned station, the door was ajar, even though it had been locked before I left. On the floor, the footprints appeared again, but now they weren't just going to my room. They were going up the walls, and on the ceiling of the room was my shadow, but upside down. And it blinked, as if to say, "You took your time." I went to the cabin. It was more deteriorated, as if it had aged 50 years in a few days. Inside, the chair was still rocking, but there was no one, just the tape recorder, working. I pressed play. The voice that came out of it was mine. "The cycle begins with the footprint and ends with oblivion. Those who follow will be followed. Those who seek will be found." And then, one last sentence. "Are you ready to be left behind?" As I left, the forest was different, denser, darker. The compass was spinning. The GPS was freezing. And then I realized there were no more footprints of mine, only theirs. And they were all pointing to me, surrounding, waiting. That's when I felt the ice give way beneath my feet. And I heard, from the bottom of the abyss, 3:12 a.m., 3:12 a.m., 3:12 a.m. I woke up in a military hospital days later. They said they found me delirious near the coast, dehydrated with no memory, with advanced hypothermia. But what no one explains is how I came back with clean boots, not a grain of ice, not a drop of moisture, and the camera in my pocket, with the recording intact. In the final video, it's not me holding the lens. It's a white hand, elongated, with only 3 fingers, and the screen ends with a sentence, written on the display, "Now it's your turn to leave footprints." Since then, every morning at 3:12 a.m., I hear footsteps on the roof of the apartment, and on the floor of the hallway, wet footprints appear, always heading towards my door, and then they disappear. But one of them, that night, stopped on the threshold, without moving forward, as if to say, "Not today, but one day, it will say, now." Few people take a job at the end of the world. Even fewer stay long enough to hear what the wind whispers behind the walls. But I went. I went because I needed to disappear. I needed to forget. I needed to hide from myself. And that's how I ended up as the new keeper of the Eldred Rock Lighthouse, a tiny island south of Haines, in the frozen heart of Alaska. My name is Liam Walker, ex-sailor, ex-husband, ex-many things. I got the offer by email. Looking for a keeper for a decommissioned station at Eldred Rock. Duties, surveillance, wind and tide recording, basic maintenance. Lonely, even better. The only requirement? Record an audio report every night. The boat dropped me off at the island on a morning of pale skies and gray seas. The lighthouse was bigger than I'd imagined. 3 stories, peeling paint, windows covered in salt and rust. The interior smelled musty and lonely, but it was clean, organized, almost lived in, as if someone still lived there. I spent the first day adjusting generators, testing radios, and exploring the floors. In the basement, I found old files, labeled folders, recordings on reels of tape, many with the same name, Jonah Pike, Chief Lighthouse Keeper. His last recording was from 1983, but strangely, the tapes seemed too new. That first night, I recorded my report. My voice was shaky, trying to sound professional. Day 1, clear skies, calm seas, no anomalies, temperatures below freezing, everything normal. I hung up. That was when the station's radio turned on by itself. Static, then a voice. Pike's log, day 1019. The seas are different. I stopped. I rewound the tape. I listened again. It was an old recording. It had to be, but when I looked at the tape reel, it was empty. The next morning, I explored the lens room, the top of the lighthouse. The view was breathtaking. Ocean as far as the eye could see, ice, sky, and nothing else. But there was something on the glass of the lens, fingerprints, as if someone had touched the inside, leaving a trail in the accumulated salt. And outside, on the damp rocks that surrounded the base of the tower, I saw footprints, a precise, deep line pointing straight to the door, but none of them were going away. On night 2, the radio turned on by itself again. Pike's log, day 1032. He knocked on the door again. At 3:20, I almost called out to him, but my mouth wouldn't open. I turned off the radio. I closed all the doors. I locked the windows, and at 3:20, I heard the knock, 3 knocks, loud, at the front door. I stood there, frozen in the dark. She knocked again, 3 times, and then silence. The next day, I listened to Pike's recordings again. Every night, the same pattern. Technical reports, silence, and then fear. He spoke of something out at sea, something approaching in the fog, standing outside, calling to him. She asks me to turn on the light, says she's lost, but if I turn it on, she'll come in. The 3rd night, I turned on the light. I don't know why I did it. Maybe curiosity, maybe arrogance. But as soon as the rotating light activated, the island shook, literally. The generator blew, the lens went out, and then the radio came back on, without me touching it. Pike's record, day 1045. I turned it on. Now I can't turn it off. It's everywhere, on the walls, on the glass, on me. I heard a sound upstairs. I ran to the lens, and there, in the reflection of the glass, someone was watching me. I fled downstairs. I locked the door. I grabbed my tape recorder and realized it was already recording itself. On the tape, it wasn't my voice. It was Jonah Pike's. If you're listening to this, it's too late. The lighthouse no longer guides ships. It traps what shouldn't have escaped. The recording ends with a whisper. She knows your name now, Liam. Today is my 4th day. The sea is calm. The sky is clear. No boats in sight. But the lens turned on its own this morning, and on the walls of the middle floor, someone wrote in salt, "Don't let the light go out. I'm afraid to sleep, afraid to hear more recordings I never made, afraid to open the door and find her waiting outside." I haven't slept in 4 nights, and not for lack of tiredness, but because the lighthouse's light never went out again. Even with the generator turned off, the wires cut, the main switch ripped from the wall. The light keeps turning, like an eye watching everything, or watching only me. The morning after that first night when the lens turned on its own, I found marks on the iron steps of the tower, wet, long footprints, as if they had been left by someone walking with very, very thin, bare feet. They went from the top of the lighthouse to my room and stopped in front of my bed. I spent the day going through the old files at the base. I found Jonah Pike's complete diary. The last notes seemed to have been written in a hurry, as if he knew he didn't have much time. Day 1048. The light no longer obeys me. She appears every night, sometimes outside, sometimes in the mirror. She started talking to me in my voice. Today I saw my reflection blink, but I didn't blink. If anyone finds this, never turn on your headlights. The pen stops abruptly. The next page is blank, and the others are torn out. That night, I locked all the doors. I barricaded myself with furniture. I turned off all the radios. I stuffed cotton in my ears. But at 3:23 a.m., I heard it, her voice, not with my ears, but inside my head. Liam, the light has seen you. You're part of the island now. The lens spun faster. The room at the top pulsed with a strange energy, as if it were trying to pull me in. The next morning, I noticed that the water had stopped running. The pipes were frozen. But when I went to the reservoir, I saw that it wasn't ordinary ice. It was salt, crystallized coarse salt, climbing up the walls of the box as if it were alive. And then I understood. The island is closing me in, locking me in here, like it did with Jonah. I went to the base of the tower, where there was a sealed hatch. It was locked, with a thick chain and a rusty padlock. But next to it, I found a key. It was warm, even in the polar cold. I opened it. The hold went down further than it should have, almost as if it went deeper than the island would allow. The walls were wet stone, dark, covered with ancient symbols carved in circles, and at the bottom, a metal door with something carved on it. The sea needs eyes. I went back up. I picked up the radio and tried to contact the supply boat. Eldred Rock Base calling. Can someone copy me? Static. Then a reply, but it was my voice. Eldred Rock, this is Liam Walker. Everything is under control. The light is safe. It's not time to leave yet. I hung up, but the radio turned on again, by itself. You haven't finished the cycle yet, Liam. That night, I heard footsteps upstairs. I went upstairs with my heart racing, and at the top of the tower, in front of the rotating lens, there I was, not a reflection, myself, standing, looking out to sea, wearing my jacket. He turned his face. It was me, but without eyes, and he said, "The light needs a guardian. Now it's your turn." And he disappeared into the brightness that exploded from the lens. Since then, every dawn at 3:23, I go up, because the light calls. If I don't go, it spins on its own, faster, hotter, more alive. It shows images that I don't know if they are memories or omens. It shows ships sinking. It shows faces screaming underwater. And it shows me sitting here, writing this, stuck, tired, part of the rotation. Today is 7 days. No boats have come. No planes have passed. The radio only responds with my own voice. And now the lens doesn't spin on its own anymore. It obeys me, because now I am the lighthouse keeper, and this island is my home, or maybe my prison. If anyone finds this notebook, take it, but be careful with the light. If it sees you, it will remember, and it will want you too.